I'll be able to show that we do have a plan in place and where the need actually is. Again, my name is Mike Mountcastle. Let's see if I go forward. Okay, good. My name is Mike Mountcastle. Since it's first time presenting, I'll just give you a brief background. I'm a North Carolina native, graduate from NC State University in aerospace engineering. So you would think I'd be representing the Division of Aviation today. But I went to work for a small engineering firm that did an eclectic mix of engineering. Most of it was structural analysis. In 1997, I began to work with a architect engineering firm in Raleigh doing building design, structural design. And in 2010, I began to work with the Capital Projects Group at the Facilities Management Unit at DOT. And you can see that is the first group up there. We do renovations, new construction. I'll skip over the two that are in highlight. We'll talk about those in a moment. The other groups with facilities or support services, they take care of DMV mail processing and printing. They mail out over 1 million pieces of mail every month. They've got about $4 to $5 million in postage. They stay pretty busy. Our property office takes care of real property, leasing, and parking in the downtown facility. We also have statewide security facility access under a facilities management group. At the bottom of the slide, you'll notice that I'll try to put a kind of a summary of what the main point of that slide is, or another point. You can see here that facilities has 44 positions. Only 18 right now are dedicated to facility maintenance. The Raleigh Maintenance Group and DMV Maintenance Group are the two groups that we have. Raleigh Maintenance takes care of the downtown Raleigh buildings. These next three slides will show each group, the building, space, budget, and staff. And again, a summary at the bottom with some numbers that you can see. The Raleigh Maintenance Group takes care of 9 buildings in the Raleigh area. These are large buildings. You can see they have over 600,000 square feet. We've got a budget of about $3 million, a little over. That's a recurring budget. I say that's total because that includes salaries, tools, supplies, everything else that goes along with that. And that's payments to contractors for repairs and things that have to happen. At the bottom, you can see 3 numbers, 95,000 square feet per employee. And then you've also got the amount of money, roughly average of $470,000 per employee that they're responsible for. But those numbers can vary greatly depending on the amount of buildings, the number of buildings, everything else. The number that I really want to concentrate on is that the $3 million divided by the square footage. You get $4.95 per square foot annual recurring cost for building maintenance. Our next maintenance group is the DMV maintenance folks. Again, we've got the buildings. They have a lot more buildings. We're dealing with 185 state-owned DMV facilities. There are more DMV facilities that are leased, and some of them are actually loaned or given or donated by the county or the city. And some of those are not really maintained very well. If you see a building that's not maintained very well, hopefully it's one of those buildings, not one of our staff maintained buildings. They've got a little bit less space overall than our Raleigh group does, which another indicator of all their buildings are much smaller. Their budget is about $3.4 million. And if you look at those same numbers at the bottom, you're looking at $7.60 a square foot recurring annual maintenance budget dedicated to these DMV buildings. We're down to 9 technicians now. That coverage map shows the 9 sections. At any given time, we'll have 3 folks on call, nights, weekends. Somebody had to be called in on this past Thanksgiving because somebody set fire inside one of the little DMV storage rooms just to get warm that day. So this stuff does happen, but 3 on-call technicians gets pretty spread out. Those 9 remaining positions that we have, 3 are vacant right now. We're working on the paperwork to fill 2 of those. But when somebody has time off or leave, they really do get stretched pretty well across the state. That leads to the main point today, our DOH, ferry, and our rail buildings. And again, we've got buildings, space, budget, and staff. On the buildings, you see 2,000 plus or minus buildings. We've got about 2,100 buildings listed with the state property office. We've got in our own database 2,380, something like that, I think it is, buildings. And there's a little margin of error because sometimes the modular buildings are listed as assets, sometimes they're not. We may have spreader racks that sometimes they're listed as a facility or a building. So there's a little bit of margin of error, but I want you to really pay attention to under that buildings. I had a pie chart to show this, but 55% of our DOT buildings are more than 50 years old. And if you remember, the State Highway Commission and the Department of Public Safety had been combined at one time back in the 30s and 40s, and they built a lot of these maintenance yards at that time. So we're dealing with a lot of older, a lot of aging structures. The space is a little over 5 million square feet. And again, at the bottom, the square foot per employee, the dollar per employee really doesn't mean anything. But the number there, if you take the budget that we get, it works out to be about 12 cents a square foot compared to the $7 and the $5 for the other two previous maintenance groups that we looked at. The DOH, we get $50,000 maintenance allocation per the 14 divisions. So that's $700,000 a year coming in as a recurring maintenance budget. The ferry division, I'm told, gets no recurring funds for ferry building maintenance, but we did get a one-time $1.6 million in capital funding for in 2021 for ferry maintenance. And we've spent $1 million of that already. I think we've got about 600 left that we will be applying to facilities in the ferry division. The rail division, I'm also told, has no specific facility recurring maintenance funds. So that's where that $12 a square foot comes from, the 700,000 divided by the 5.68 million square feet. In the division of highway buildings, there is one exception. The rest areas are being maintained. Those are being maintained by each division through janitorial contracts. I don't know. I don't have numbers for those. I don't know if they're being funded separately or if it's from the just where that money comes from. But it's interesting to me that we've got very few dedicated maintenance staff and very little recurring budget for most DOH ferry and rail buildings. The rest areas are the exception. They're being maintained by the division through those contracts I mentioned. And the one thing about the Raleigh Maintenance Group, the Raleigh buildings, the DMV buildings, and the rest areas, the one thing they have in common is the public involvement. And so we are taking care of our buildings that the public sees. But we've got a lot of these buildings out in these maintenance yards that have been out there since the 40s and 50s, and the public rarely goes to those yards. Those are the buildings that are being maintained with 12 cents a square foot. So let's move on. This chart gets a little bit busy, but I hope that everybody can understand what we're trying to put. Everything I just said, try to put on this one slide. The small pie chart shows the proportion of buildings being maintained based on the budget that they have. And that little tiny sliver of yellow up there on the left-hand pie chart is the 9 buildings that the Raleigh Maintenance Group handles. So I put that one off to the side. That one's based on building count. The larger pie chart is based on the actual square footage of the buildings. And that makes those little diet-sized pieces of pie a little bit larger. That yellow is the Raleigh group. And you see the $4.95 a square foot recurring cost. I do want to point out the fact that in Raleigh, we are working on a couple capital improvement projects on the downtown transportation building, And we've got an $8 million project going on there right now to upgrade some restrooms, add a generator. We do not have a generator, never have had a generator on the main highway building, but we hope to have that done in about a year. So every now and then that $4.95 does get a boost with capital projects. The DMV group, you see again that green slice of pie is the proportion of buildings based on square footage again that gets $7.60 a square foot. The overwhelming majority of that, the orange, is the DOH buildings minus the blue strip, which are the rest areas. and they're being maintained right now at a current value of 12 cents per square foot. A lot of these buildings won't be repaired. If we get money to repair a lot of these buildings, they're going to go away. There is a building, and believe it or not, in Buncombe County that was built in 1930. That's 93 years old. It's been pretty much decommissioned. We're not in it right now, but that's just, we're not going to repair that building. It's not worth it, not worth the investment. Again, at the bottom of the slide, I just say most non-public DOT buildings lack adequate maintenance resources in terms of staff and budget. If I can go back, does this go back? The staff for our DOH ferry and rail buildings is every highway division, and including ferry and rail, has a staff engineer or somebody who is the facility coordinator for that group. It may be a position, but more than likely it's a role. It's just another hat that they wear. So they're taking care of these buildings, and they notify us of any discrepancies. Quite often we have to say, no, we don't have enough funding for it, but sometimes we are able to fit it in, and we'll find budget, money where we can. Adequate versus inadequate funding. One thing that dedicated maintenance staff can do is to catalog the amount of maintenance needed, the repair work. They can anticipate what's coming. This aerial photo on the left is what we call the Century Center buildings. They're just off Pool Road here in Raleigh. And if you look at those two buildings, you see the little dots on top. I've circled two of them with the red circles. Those are rooftop units. And I've counted those about 3 or 4 times. I get 101 one day and 99 the next. And I'm just going to say for the purpose of this slide, that we've got 100 rooftop units up here. If we replace one of those units, it's in between 15 to 20,000 per replacement, maybe up to 25, depending on what we get into. We have to replace these units generally every 15 years. Having a good dedicated staff like we do with this building, they can plan ahead and they can pick the top 10 that we may replace this year. Next year, replace 8 more. Next year, maybe 10 more. And by the time we get full rotation around, it'll be time to start thinking about replacing those original ones again. That's what the $4.95 a square foot will buy. It will give us, adequate maintenance and planning and being able to fix things and repair things before they fall apart and have to be completely replaced. At $12 a square foot, you see this little shed here. This was just an add-on. It was something that was built years ago. The folks out in the field are very resourceful. They built this shed, put metal roof on it. And I just want to say, as far as shingle roofs and metal roofs go, those are very cost effective. If you replace them every 20 years, you're talking 5 to 15 on a larger building, maybe $20,000. That's relatively inexpensive. But if you wait to the point that it leaks and you have structural repair, rot, and damage and that sort of thing, it can be quite expensive. So I just want to say investing in preventive maintenance will actually save money down the road. It's not just us saying that we have a large need. The State Construction Office has what they call the Facility Condition Assessment Program, the FCAP report. They did a report and they're showing over $100 million in ADA upgrades for DOT, $13 million in energy upgrades, life safety, $426 million. They're showing targeted renovation at $259 million. That's a big number, but we can't immediately ask for all that funding because that's just unrealistic. This is a very high level view of things. We really need to get down into the weeds and look at individual buildings. Some of them aren't worth using. One of the things we plan to do is to consolidate more buildings. Instead of having a maintenance yard that has one county maintenance building, a bridge maintenance building, and then another maintenance building, we can consolidate those into one office building. That consolidates your restrooms, your break rooms, that sort of thing. We can do the same thing with truck sheds. Instead of multiple truck sheds on one yard that take more maintenance and more space, we can put those together into one good truck shed. So anyway, this is just confirmation from another agency that there is a great need out there for our Division of Highways buildings on these maintenance yards. The next few slides will illustrate some of that. Just for comparison, I looked at the DOA website, Department of Administration website, and I also had a conversation with their facilities director. He's very helpful and offered to get together with me sometime and let's trade some ideas. But they've got 125 buildings. We have 2,000. They've got 5 million square feet. We had 5 million something square feet for DOH buildings. And they've got a budget of about $28 million. Now, some of that he spends on utility bills, but we're looking at $700,000 for our DOH buildings that we just saw in the previous slide. DOA facilities has more than 120 employees. The previous slide that we saw for facilities management, we've got 18 right now that are dedicated to facility maintenance. That was a laser pointer, sorry. This is a building that is kind of typical. It was built years ago. You can see the mezzanine up there at the top. I've got a blue rectangle around that 1 2x4. This mezzanine may have been part of the original construction, or it may have been added by DOT staff years later. But you know, somebody realized there's a potential for somebody falling off of that mezzanine. So they put one piece of 2x4 up there. As a structural engineer, that does not meet the requirements for a guardrail. They need to have a second guardrail down below, so where you can't get anything more than 21 inches through. But one piece of 2x4, given that length, won't be able to support the lateral load that you're supposed to have. It obviously gives a visual boundary, so it is something. But the one on the right has no such boundary or anything at all. So having facility maintenance staff who can go through and look at these buildings can identify potential safety issues like this. This building is in Greensboro. If you think about Greensboro years ago being about this big, this building was way out here in the county. Now it's inside the city of Greensboro at the Camp Burton Maintenance Facility. We've got about 42 buildings on that yard. I thought about having a slide showing that yard and maybe showing the buildings that we could consolidate, but I didn't. I had to cut this down so I don't spend too much time. This building, if you look at the very top, you see exposed rafter tails. That's a maintenance nightmare. And it's just a maintenance nightmare. I'll leave it at that. At the bottom near the grass, you can see some evidence of decay and maintenance needs on the siding there. But this slide I also added to the side, what about the things we don't see, given the ages of our buildings? Do we have electrical in there that meet code? What about insulation, plumbing, heating and fuel piping, termite damage? Asbestos is a big deal that we have to deal with. Lead pipe or lead paint, code compliance, ADA compliance, all these things show up in these old buildings. I apologize for this slide, sort of. This is inside the same building. If you look between the water closet and the plunger there, you can see there's a hole that they cut into the slab to install new plumbing to go over to that new water heater. And this is evidence of the folks out in the field being resourceful with what they have. They make the best with what they have. We're not interior designers, but again, this is a very old building, and trying to work too much in this thing, it isn't really worth it, but they got it going again. This building is still in use. So this is what happens sometimes with limited maintenance resources. I do want to say that our folks out in the field where the rubber meets the road, they're very resourceful. They're very talented. I've seen some awesome work that they've done. I saw a stainless steel sprayer with attachments and everything else down in Wilmington once. And I was so impressed with it. I asked about it. Where did they buy it? Somebody made it. They made it in the shop. I've seen them make all kinds of neat things. So these employees out there that you guys, that the General Assembly employs for taking care of transportation, roads and bridges, are really a great group of folks. And I feel like I've privileged to stand up here and not advocate for me or for facilities, but for those employees and getting them better facilities to work in. And I, again, appreciate this opportunity. This salt shed, you can see in the blue circle that the anchor bolts along the edge of that wall are very near failure from corrosion from the salt. That back wall is actually laying on the ground. It has already come loose and the wind has blown it enough. It's fallen down. I don't know if I mentioned, but this is in Raleigh, so this stuff is not far from us. The little building, believe it or not, to the right, this is in Randolph County. It's a DOT building. It used to be the Traffic Services Sign Shop, but it was never really properly maintained. DOT moved out of it. The Department of Public Safety has some things stored in there. Now, that building really doesn't stop any weather events at all, except for some sun. It provides shade, and that's about it. But I just for kicks and grins, this was built in 1945 at 78 years old. If we had spent $5,000 every 20 years to put new shingles on this building and $6,000 for new paint every year, $100 every 10, $6,000 every 10 years, $100 in termite protection every 10 years, that would have worked out to be $1.41 per year per square foot. This is a small building, 610 square foot. So it wouldn't have taken an awful lot of money to keep that building painted and caulked and up. It still would not be a great building at this point, but it may not look quite like it does. We've got a couple more pictures of some old buildings, missing siding, that sort of thing. If you look at the small picture to the right with the wires, that red wire, I think may be a hot wire. It's one of the three phases coming into that panel box. We don't know if it's disconnected before it gets to that panel box. Somebody did put some tape on it, but it's disconnected. It's just floating around. That's a safety issue, number one, and a fire issue, number two. Having dedicated maintenance staff to go through and do routine inspections of all our building systems would hopefully catch these things before they become a problem. When I started 2010, I was told about this truck shed down in Lumberton. You see the roof was completely blown off in 2005. A thunderstorm took it out. We started asking for capital funding to replace it. We finally got the funding in place and we got it designed and built in 2015. That was 10 years later. I don't have a picture of the new shed. It's great. It looks good. But the point of that slide and that story is waiting on capital funding can be an issue. And if we had discretionary maintenance funding that would be able to replace that roof or to recognize this building isn't worth replacing, maybe building a new one, we could have turned that around in possibly a year instead of 10 years. Again, as a structural engineer, these photos here really scare somebody. The roof trusses up there have already failed. The roof has not collapsed, obviously. Thank God for safety factors and repetitive members and the fact that we normally don't see the full live load on a building. This building may not have had a full 90-mile-an-hour wind come into it yet, or it hasn't had a 20-pound per square foot live load on top. The column base down there is totally corroded, and we don't really know what holds that up at this point other than, again, safety factors. We see a wiring mess up there. Getting to the need, I think we presented the need. The preventive maintenance budget, we could try to identify all the maintenance needs on all of our projects. But at some point, we have to put the pencil down and just recognize we've got a need. And somebody has done a lot of these numbers. The National Academies Press suggests between 2 to 4% of the building value for maintenance budgets. I see on this slide, after we subtract off the buildings that are being maintained, you're looking at $12 to $22.8 million in budget. I've talked about the staff. We're looking at a minimum of 14 full-time permanent technicians per division. They would be intimate with each division and be the coordinator, the liaison for that division. I've included their salary. And if you look, you're looking at about $200,000 per staff, but they would be putting about $800 to $1.6 million worth of work out on the local economy for those repairs and replacements. Our plan, we've got a plan in place. I apologize for this page here. This page, I actually had a border around it, but this comes out of our facility maintenance manual that we have. And we do all of our work requests in SAP. They're tied to a specific building, a functional location in SAP. So we've got a plan in place. It just needs funding and staff. We can use these reports from SAP to provide annual reports on what we're doing. And hopefully we could make this pie chart look a little bit better with either somewhere between $2.41 a square foot to $4.28 per square foot. I've got some ideas about what a preventive maintenance plan would look like. I've got an email that I got back from a question I sent to one of the division engineers, and I will move that along. Here's a building that we built in Scotland County. We did this in-house design, and I'm going to wrap it up because I think I'm running out of time. I really appreciate the opportunity to present. Okay.
Thank you, Michael, for a wonderful presentation. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions and discussion. Chairman Aller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions, and I've been hanging around this committee for a few years, and I probably have heard this, but it not quite the way you presented it. And I'm really struck that we have put enough millions into different kinds of maintenance. And I'm not sure what the number is we put into building maintenance across the state or Raleigh, but is this an absolute number of 700 million or 600 plus million? Or is this the difference between what you have now and what you would like to see?
It would be the absolute, that last slide would show what we are asking for what would be required to maintain the DOH buildings minus the rest areas and the Raleigh buildings and the DMV buildings. We've got those groups in place already. I see no need to really change those at this time.
Follow up. I may have more than one follow up. You mentioned rest areas, and I made a note, went back when you were talking about them, and there was no funding for rest areas. Now I know somewhere there's funding for rest areas.
There is, and
where is that?
What I was saying, I didn't have a chance to track that funding down. I don't know how the divisions pay for that, but the divisions do pay for the rest area maintenance. And I don't know if that's a special fund that they have or if that comes off of their general maintenance reserve. I just don't know. I can follow up and get that to you.
Follow up. I believe it is in the general maintenance reserve for each of the divisions. I believe that's correct. But again, I'm just trying to track back what we need to do.
Chairman Aller, I think Lisa has an answer to your question.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Eiler, some of those funds for the rest areas comes out of the roadside environmental, and then also some of it comes out of general maintenance reserve.
Okay.
Thank you, Lisa.
Okay. Additional follow up. And y'all engineers, if you consider what the efficiency of some of these divisions, my reference is the district yard in Brunswick County in Charlotte, and they got 4 or 5 buildings on site. A little office building and some storage and equipment, so forth. Have you considered any kind of consolidation or tearing down? I mean, your bulldozer might be a good solution to some of those buildings we saw.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering, is it fix or tear down or consolidate or even sale or terminate leases? I mean, has that all been considered in this?
Absolutely. And it's my experience that when you have a maintenance yard, there are small groups in that yard. This is my area. This is my area. But I don't really look at those yards that way. I look at that maintenance yard is for DOT. We're all the same DOT. Let's consolidate the bridge maintenance group and maybe the equipment maintenance and the other groups into one office. Now you have one conference room that is shared. It's much easier to maintain. It's cheaper to build. We definitely see consolidation. Same with the truck sheds and the salt sheds, things like that. We certainly do. And we are working on a 10-year facility plan, which will definitely lend itself to that.
Okay, follow up. Probably my last one. Final. I think we will be considering increasing your maintenance budget, and want to break down that 700 almost a million to the annual amount, maybe 22 or whatever. But we also like to see a report back of efficiencies, how that can be quantified.
I kind of skipped over it in that last slide, but I was wanting to say that we will be glad to present reports either annually, quarterly reports, all of the work is requests are being put into SAP. They are tied to each building, and we are able to pull those reports out. We can show that the money is being spent, or it hasn't been spent. We need a little bit less, or we need more. And I see it as an iterative process over the years, but we certainly will dialogue back and forth with you guys how that works.
Thank you. Chairman McGinnis, you're recognized.
Just a quick one. I'm with Representative Eiler that I think we need a plan of demolition, a plan of consolidation, and I think we need it sooner than later. I think that this is appalling what I've seen today, and it's not only what I've seen here, but what I've seen in the field. And we do not need to throw good money after bad, and that's what we're doing. So I'm not going to belabor the point. You don't even have to answer. I just want to put that request in. Mr. Chairman, I know we're running short of time. The Ferry Division is awaiting us, so I'd move that we move forward.
Thank you. No further questions. Thank you, Michael, for your presentation. It was very, very well done. I do have a series of questions. We can ask those offline. Now I'll ask Nick to please come forward. Nick Clerkin is going to go through with us the Ferry Division overview of the budget.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Nick Clerkin here in fiscal research. I'm going to start by talking to you a little bit about an overview of the Ferry Division, as well as the budget for the Ferry Division. After me, you'll be hearing from Jeremy from the Ferry Division, talking about some of the vessel replacement projects that are underway. I'm going to just quickly overview the statute and sort of the powers and authorities of the Ferry Division and what's required of it by law, and then take an overarching look at ferry activities, the various routes that they operate, give you an overview of the budget, where that stands today, as well as go into some of the past budget issues that the General Assembly had identified with the Ferry Division, and talk about what those were, and then really spend a lot of time on the recent actions of the General Assembly that were taken related to those issues that were identified, and go through those per each piece of legislation that has been done in that area, and then we'll hear from the Ferry Division. So the statute here, this is the first part of GS 136-82, the powers of the department, and so looking there, the establishment and maintenance of ferries connecting the parts of the state highway system. So the purpose of the Ferry Division, is connecting those various areas within the highway network that are not served otherwise by highways, or to provide essentially a shortcut where instead of driving all the way around a long ways, you could take a shorter route over the water. And so it's authorized to acquire, own, lease, charter, or otherwise control all necessary vessels, boats, terminals, or other facilities to operate those ferries, or to contract for those purposes as well. So within the general statute that covers the Ferry Division, some other authorities are to toll 4 routes. So there's the Southport Fort Fisher, Cedar Island Ocracoke, Swan Quarter Ocracoke, as well as the Ocracoke Passenger Ferries seasonal route, and the other route shall not be tolled. And those tolls have a very specific purpose. Those tolls are to be used for vessel replacement per the law, and it has to be within the division where the toll was collected. Some other authorities here. Suspending the tolling during states of emergency to get people out of vulnerable areas, to generate receipts on all ferry routes from things such as concessions and priority boarding fees, as well as any personal information associated with ferry travel is confidential, and that's something that's specified in the statute as well. So just to give you a brief overview, on the left there, you'll see a map of the Ferry Division. So there's 7 different vehicle ferry routes. You'll see that 3 of those are going to Ocracoke Island, which is not otherwise connected to the state road network. So you've got Cedar Island, Swan Quarter, and Hatteras there at the south end of Highway 12 there. Then there's the passenger ferry, which also goes down into the village in Ocracoke from Hatteras Point. And then there's several other routes throughout the state, starting in the northeast, Knott's Island, Currituck, to avoid driving through Virginia. There's a route across the sound there. There's also Aurora Bay View, Minnesota Beach and Cherry Branch, and Southport and Fort Fisher, and those all prevent a longer trip around. So I said 3 tolled routes. I should have written that as 3 tolled routes plus the passenger ferry. So again, those are the Southport, Fort Fisher, Swan Quarter, and Cedar Island, and the passenger ferry as well. The other routes may not be tolled per the law. There's 21 vessels in 2022 that carried 1.6 million passengers in that calendar year. So I'll also point out the Mans Harbor State Shipyard. That's where a lot of the work gets done. And with 21 vessels, there's a lot of work to do to maintain those vessels. There's a lot of federal requirements on how much maintenance has to be done from the Coast Guard. And Mans Harbor Shipyard is where a lot of those employees are located and where a lot of that work gets done. And just as a general point, this is the 2nd largest state-run ferry system in the United States. Washington State is the 1st. Talk a little bit about the cost of operating each of the various routes. So this table shows essentially what the total cost was for fiscal year 21-22, the prior fiscal year. And this report was required by the General Assembly in the 2021 Appropriations Act. And so I've added up the figures for each 6-month report for that year, and to show you the total cost of about $54.7 million that year of operating all the various ferry routes. And that includes not just the staff on those routes, but also, any maintenance associated with the vessels, fuel costs, things of that nature. And then the number of passengers that went on those services during the year. And so you got a total of about 1.6 million there. But the total cost per passenger about $34 per passenger on the ferry division routes. So you see it does range quite significantly depending on the route, from $15 on Southport Fort Fisher to $84 on the Swan Quarter Ocracoke, and that's mostly a function of the length of the route. A very short route, Southport Fort Fisher, versus about a 2.5 hour each way from Swan Quarter to Ocracoke. So there's a big range there. So that gives you kind of a broad overview of what each route costs and what the total costs are. A brief budget overview for the ferry division. This is in the certified budget for the current fiscal year of just under $58 million for the ferry division. And there's 500 full-time equivalent employees. So 500 positions that they have. Just as like a fun fact, I guess that's larger than any one highway division has for its employees. Now but it's a very large area of FTE, certainly within the modes and within the DOT as a whole. So because of all those FTE, your major cost there is going to be personal services. So that's just under $40 million for all the salaries and benefits, as well as temporary employee salaries that the ferry division pays. So that's going to be about 2/3 the cost. Another big factor there that you'll see is the supplies related to the ferry division. So there's the fuel costs are a big part of that. Property, plant, and equipment. Those funds can go to the vessel to buy new parts for the vessels, as well as things such as some of the improvements to some of the buildings that the ferry division maintains. They've got a lot of buildings, as Mike was discussing, and then so those are the kind of the main areas of the budget for the ferry division. I want to talk a little bit about the past budget issues that the ferry division has faced. So on the left there, number one, matching it up to the one in my bullets there, was essentially the ferry division was allowed to overdraft each year. And this created a structural deficit for the ferry division. That chart right there is a presentation that they gave to the ferry division gave to this committee in 2021 from one of their slides. And what it shows, the scissor chart, what it shows there is that each year's appropriations are immediately docked at the beginning of the year to pay for the overdrafts of the prior fiscal year. Essentially doing that every year, they're out of step with what they're budgeted and what they were spending. And there's a lot of divisions within DOT, as you've heard from this committee, that can overdraft, but I'm just identifying it here for the ferry division. So getting into why that was the case, the capital and operations budget were not separated. And so when capital costs would come in the door for things like vessel replacement, that was all coming out of the same budget as their operations budget. Some of those funds were being, carried forward on one hand for capital and then spent, leading to a large amount of spending in particular years where those costs came into play. Another big factor here was the salary increases. So there had been several salary increases directed by the General Assembly, such as the DOT salary pilot, which allowed targeted raises to various employees, and as well as just the typical legislative increases that were given, percentage increases for all employees. So what was happening there was that the ferry division was having to absorb those costs for the employees. They were all getting paid more, but DOT was not going in and adjusting the budget to reflect that for the salary increases. And so they have the same budget, but higher salary expenses. And as you saw, salaries are a big part of what their division spends on. So those factors led to the accumulation of a large overdraft, as you see on the left there. So going down to section 2, kind of a lack of transparency in the budget. Number 2 on the left there, you see that was the certified budget for the 2020-21 fiscal year. And you'll see there that I can fit it on this slide because it's just one line there for all the expenditures within the ferry division, other than their kind of high level administrative costs. So that's 52 million. If you crack open your budget, that's all that you would see for the ferry division. And this is not just an issue with the ferry division. There's a lot of areas within DOT where the budget looks very similar to this. But in particular, when looking into why is this overdraft occurring, it's hard to get a sense for that based on the budget that's listed there. Typically with the agency, you break it into the chart of accounts, like I showed you before, with personal services, purchase services, et cetera. And that's something that will be part of the General Assembly's actions that we'll reveal. So also want to mention the receipts there. So we know that those ferry tolls go to replacing vessels, but those funds were just shown at a high level, and the total balance of those funds that had accumulated over many years was not being shown on any financial statement that DOT was putting out. So through accumulating those funds, it was hard to know how much was available for vessel replacement overall. So to talk about what went on in the 2021-180, the 2021 Appropriations Act, a lot of activities here to address some of those problems. So one thing that was done was separating out the capital funds to create a special fund for ferry vessel replacement, the Ferry Capital Special Fund. As Mike had mentioned earlier, there was also some funding done through capital repairs and renovations section of that 1.6 million that was given to the ferry division for some improvements to their facilities. And then instead of overdrafting some funds and carrying forward others, the carry forward authority was eliminated, requiring all unspent appropriations to be transferred to the special fund for future vessel replacement. So if they came in under budget for the year, those funds would be transferred over for future vessel replacement. Another thing in creating that special fund was sending those receipts that the ferry gets from tolls and concessions, et cetera, to the special fund to show that in a transparent manner so it's known where all those funds are being stored. The General Assembly used the over collections, the additional revenue over budget that DOT took in for that year, part of that, and funded a total forgiveness of the $8 million overdraft that had accumulated over several years. It also funded the ongoing vessel construction of the Avon and the Salvo using $5.3 million. And just as a reminder, this was the total cost that the ferry division came to the General Assembly with and said, this is the amount that we need to spend on all the closeout costs for these vessels, as well as legal fees and a 5% contingency. So that was the amount that was appropriated for vessel construction. Now, as part of that, the overdraft authority going forward was removed, so they were not unable to overdraft in future years. The recurring budget was increased by about 14 to 16% in each year of the biennium to account for those unallocated past salary increases, to adjust their budget up to reflect the payment that their employees were getting, but was not being budgeted for, as well as the increases from the that act that did additional legislative increases. Within the committee report, and I'll show you that in just a second, the various fund codes that were all part of ferries were all combined into one, and the funding was listed out per the chart of accounts. And it required that OSBM certify in this manner following the chart of accounts for the ferry division, so that the high level categories of spending would be clear when you opened up the budget and looked at it. And then another thing, as you saw with the cost per route, that was a required report that was put in to this as well. And over the biennium, it was just under $30 million when you add all those various factors up that was appropriated to the ferry division over the 21 to 23 biennium. I wanted to show you this. So this is what the capital special fund looks like, and it's in DOT's monthly financial statements. Each month, you can look at the financial statements and see this all broken out separately, which you weren't able to see before. So the totals here reflect, you can see the current month, the receipts that each different route brings in, and it also says what division they're in. The year-to-date totals of what each route has brought in and what has gone into various funds, as well as what was done in the prior year. And those numbers are a lot higher in the prior year because that 21.4 million figure was all the transfers from all the years that had accumulated for ferry for ferry revenues. You also see what's expected for the year. About 2.5 million a year in ferry receipts typically come in. And I'm going to just back out of this so I can zoom in a little bit on here. But I wanted to, excuse me, sorry about that. Wanted to just talk a little bit about how the budget was restructured and kind of just remind y'all through the committee report what was done here. So you see before about 49.5 million in each year of the biennium at the top right there. But going down, just to kind of give a big broad level overview, these were this first section was the legislative increases. And so typically this is done at a department-wide level. You just give DOT the total amount that it needs for salaries, and DOT allocates it out to the other divisions. But because these salary increases had not been reflected in the ferry division, they were appropriated separately. So that's a bit unusual compared to other divisions that you might see in that budget. You also see kind of what I'm calling here budget reset. So this was eliminating various fund codes that the ferry division had funds in, and then transfer, and then zeroing out that line that was showing just everything under one fund code and kind of rebuilding the budget from the ground up. This section I'm calling chart of accounts, and this appropriates the funds that were going to those employees within the division, as well as the other various areas within the chart of accounts: purchase services, supplies, property, plant, equipment. And that was based on analysis as well as requests from the ferry division as to what those funding levels needed to be. And then the transfer there at the bottom of the receipts into the special fund taken out of the highway fund. So in total, you see it goes up from 49.5 million to about 56.2 and then 57.2 million for the ferry division. Moving along, the revenues that go into this is the summary of the capital fund. The revenues that go into that fund from each route, as well as some over collections transferred in to build up the capital fund, and then the expenditures here for the Avon and for the Salvo, and this was the total amount requested by the ferry division to close out those vessels. So moving along, going back to presentation mode here, couple of additional General Assembly actions. One was through the technical corrections. So this changed the requirements. Instead of all funds going into the capital fund for vessel replacement, funds that were classified as encumbered would be deposited in that fund in a specified fund code for encumbrances. And so when you think of encumbrances, something like, you know, a contract that was made in 1 year, but the delivery of the contract was not until the next year for like say if they're purchasing new parts for a vessel or something like that, it could be an example of encumbrances. And then in the 2022 Appropriations Act, like you saw in the last one where it was separated out, what the legislative increases, that was done that way again for the percent raises for employees, as well as for the retention funds that were given to all agencies of about 661,000 there. Since these are big budget changes, we've as the FRD staff has been monitoring them closely. So implementation of the encumbrances section. At first, looking at this, essentially all of the funds that were unspent, that 54 million figure that you saw earlier, is about 2 million that were unspent. Initially, all of those were classified as encumbrances, but we worked with the department as well as OSBM, and the department worked with OSBM as well to see which of those were encumbrances like I described, and they determined that figure was about 920,000, with the rest of that going into vessel replacement, the other additional about 1.1 million going into vessel replacement. And then overall spending, obviously without the ability to overdraft, it's something we're monitoring more carefully. Essentially, you know, they spent 33.8 million of that, roughly 58 million through January. That's about 58%. Not the most expert budget analysis here, but if you divide 7 by 12 for 7 months a year, that's also 58%. So they're essentially, you know, right on target for the year as of right now with their budget. And so you'll hear next from the Ferry Division about some of those vessel replacement projects. And this is essentially the request that they received that they'll address, which is there's been a lot of questions over the years about the passenger ferry, which they'll address that was completed, and talk about the outstanding resolution there, or the resolution there of any outstanding costs. They'll also talk about the Avon and Salvo, which are 2 vehicle ferries that are not in service at this time, that have been under construction for a while. And then any additional budget requests that they may have are related to the ferry capital fund that to be appropriated, as well as the timeline on the vessel replacement. This is something that's in the STIP. There's another vessel replacement in the 2nd year of this upcoming biennium as of today in the STIP. So this replacement, they're going to discuss where they're at with that as well. And that concludes my presentation, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Nick. Very well done, very detailed. I want to welcome Senator Raven this morning. Senator Raven, you're recognized.
Oh, thank you. I think this may be the appropriate time, and I have a series of questions, Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized.
I will start off with a very brief statement, and this is no reflection on the Ferry Division, because the guys that run these vessels and do the everyday, they're good at what they do. This is a reflection on the Department of Transportation in the state of North Carolina. But without a doubt, this is one of the sorriest business models I have ever in my life witnessed. One of the very sorriest. Every single thing in this state that we own that floats is underwater, folks. And it is deplorable. We're putting $50 million, $60 million a year into, and again, upon a sinking fund. It's ridiculous. We're not doing our job as legislators. And my blood pressure gets up every time I come in, and it has for the last 12 years, and think about how poorly we manage this asset. And it's a valuable asset, but it is poorly managed. Now, I have a couple of questions and a lot of them after this that I'd like to ask. First, additional budgetary requests from Ferry Capital Fund for completion of MV Avon and MV Salvo. Are those vessels on tolled routes?
So
Are they
those,
going to be on tolled routes?
Senator Raymond, yes. My understanding is that, those vessels are serving untold routes.
Thank
Is my understanding.
That's my understanding as well. Now, here's my query, and this is my frustration, folks. We told state of North Carolina, Department of Transportation, Ferry Division, some years ago, if you don't want to toll your ferry, we'll live with that. You want to, but when you replace that ferry, just as this I read, they shall not be tolled. That ferry shall be replaced out of your division's money. That means you don't come back to me begging more money. So I want the division engineer in those divisions to tell me what he or she is going to cut to replace that ferry, because I am not going to vote to give you more money. That is in the law. It is in the statute. Several years ago, and I don't believe a one of you in this room within this was here other than you and you. And we called in the Secretary of Transportation, and Senator Heiss said in that meeting, do we have to pass a law to tell the Department of Transportation to follow the law? I'm saying we don't. Now, by gum and by golly, I want to know how they're going to replace these ferries out of their division. Did they set some money aside every year? If not, shame on them. They want to come to us and beg? Shame on me for allowing that. That is not the statute that we passed, and that is not the spirit. They want to toll, and these fine. But you figure out a way to replace your ferry, because these others that we are tolling are doing that. And they may come up short, but we're remiss in our duties if we continually let one branch or one part of this state get away with not following the statute, and we continue to fund it. We're not doing our job, folks. We're sending a bad message. So they can figure it out, and they can report to us, and I'm going to request that at some point, just how they plan to do it, because obviously they cannot manage their allowance and their piggy bank. And so we're going to have to manage their piggy banks for them. And I don't want to have to do that, but this has been a bone in my craw. It was $40 million when I came here. We were losing every year. Now we're losing $60 million. I've been here 12 years. Do the math. It's over $500 million. $500 million to build one heck of a bridge. Pave a lot of roads. That's an annual pavement we're doing. We are putting it in an underwater account. And that is not smart, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this committee. It is not smart, and we need to address it. Thank you, Senator Raven. Thank you. Chairman Sawyer, you recognize.
Thank you. It's hard to follow that, but in that same vein, I agree with everything Senator Raven is saying, and that's a lot of the budget provisions you saw in our last budget was specifically to address and put some guardrails on this division. Drilling down on the Avon and Salvo, Nick, could you kindly remind me how much was budgeted for the purchase of those boats, and when was that budgeted? Then again, how much did we give them the General Assembly give them last budget cycle? And lastly, have you heard from them that they need more money?
Nick, you recognize.
Senator Sawyer, thank you for your questions. In terms of what was the total budget for those vessels, I believe was the contracted amount total was about $22 million to build those two vessels together. That's about 11 million each was what the contract was for. The amount that was outstanding as of when the 2021 budget was passed was those figures of 4.3 million for the Avon and about 900,000 for the Salvo, and that was reported to the General Assembly by the Ferry Division, and then appropriated out for those vessels.
Follow-up?
Follow-up. And then have you heard from the Ferry Division if they are requiring more money for the completion of those boats?
Well, I think in reviewing the presentation that the Ferry Division will give to this committee, that there is additional outstanding amount above and beyond that amount that was appropriated of about $2.5 million.
Follow-up?
Thank you. One last question, please. So of all the Ferry Division routes, there's only one that doesn't have a blacktop alternative, correct?
So, so there, if we go back to, let me just go back to our map here. So there are several, I guess you could say blacktop alternatives to these routes. So if you look at, I believe there are 4 where you could drive instead, but where the ferry is typically going to be shortening the route. So in Knott's Island, Currituck, you drive up through Virginia. With Bayview, Aurora, you could drive all the way down there through Washington. You could drive from Minnesota Beach to Cherry Branch through New Bern, and you could drive in Southport to Fort Fisher up through Wilmington. So there are alternatives. They do typically take longer. I think Knott's Island, Currituck is about the same travel time, but the other ones do significantly shorten the travel time.
Thank you, Nick.
Just administrative comment. We ask as many questions as you like. We've made an arrangement that if we need to carry it through tomorrow, we will if we run out of time. So any Chairman Eiler, you recognize?
Very quickly, a little bit more history. We looked at tolling about 10 years ago, and some of the routes some people use for getting to work in 30 minutes instead of 2 hours. And we get a lot of feedback, to put it mildly. And we kept the tolling about the way it was, or they've had slight increases in the toll routes. But again, these are the folks, these are their highways on the coast to a great degree. And very near and dear to my heart, obviously, where I live. And Central Raven is very well versed in all this also because where he lives. But the point is that we got to figure out how to solve it, not just cut them off, but hold the feet to the fire at the same time. So it's very vital, but important. It's economical too.
Thank you. Senator McGinnis, you recognize?
Well, I totally agree with Representative Eiler. The folks that use it as a roadway, we need to have a comment or two for them. But the folks that are coming in here that are not using it as roadways, we need to have a price for them as well. The passenger ferry, do we know how many are tourists or how many are locals that use the passenger ferry to Ocracoke? Is that something that is easily obtainable number, or is that something that we don't have?
Thank you.
Senator McGinnis, we may be able to get that information. I know that typically with the vehicle ferries, they do offer a breakdown by the license plate, and that's typically how it's assessed, whether they're local versus not. But in terms of the passengers, I know they have taken surveys, but I don't think it's like something that every time you get on and off, you know, if you're a local versus a visitor. My recollection is that from the surveys that mostly visitors were using the passenger ferry.
Follow up.
On the Avon and the Salvo, now I understand they are behind, they're overdue, they're past due, they've had a myriad of significant delays, some caused by acts of God that we have no control over in the storm or something like that. Do we have, or are we going to receive today an update as to where we are from the time they're supposed to have been delivered versus what the actual delivery date is?
Okay.
Thank you. So you will receive an update from the Ferry Division on that. As of today, I believe the liquidated damages that have been accruing, to use that date as a I think it's 677 days, so just under 2 years past when those liquidated damages started accruing.
What is the liquidated damage rate? Do we have that number? Or is that something we need to get offline?
Yes, sir. We have that number. That is $1,000 per day.
Okay. A follow-up. That is an absolute stupid number on the amount of money that we have involved in these contracts. This is not the first time I've seen a stupid number that does not reflect on the reality of the value of the delay. And the taxpayers of the state of North Carolina, I'm gonna raise my voice along with Senator Rabin now. The taxpayers of the state of North Carolina deserve better than this.
Thank you, Senator McGinnis. Any other questions? Comments? All right, Nick, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Very appreciated. And now we'll ask the Ferry Division, Jeremy Rem, to please come forward and provide his presentation. Keep in mind that we do have a hard stop at 10 till, and if we do not finish, we'll carry on till tomorrow. Morning. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. My name is Jeremy Remy. I'm an engineering supervisor with the Ferry Division. A little bit about me. I'm originally from Wisconsin. I got civil engineering degree from University of Wisconsin. Then I worked for about 15 years in the private industry doing marine construction really around the world. Moved out to the Outer Banks in 2019 and started working with the Ferry Division just over a year ago in December of 21. Today I'll be discussing with you the vessel construction updates that everyone is quite curious to hear. So we'll be going through the passenger ferry completion resolution, the motor vessel Avon Salvo contracts, the ferry capital fund, Silver Lake replacement, and then our vessel contracting and construction work group. And then 2021, before I got involved, the Ferry Division, recognizing the need for more engineering expertise in-house, kind of restructured the organization, and they created the position for the engineering supervisor, trying to increase the in-house expertise, which is the position that I ended up coming online with. Luckily for me, my red and white colors of the Wisconsin Badgers blended in quite well with the NC State colors. So starting with the passenger ferry, the contract was awarded to the lowest bidder. It was $4.1 million contract after supplemental agreements. The final contract value was $4.4 million. The NCDOT had paid the contractor $3.6 million before the contract went into default, and the contractor ended up going bankrupt. At that point, the surety, the bonding company, took over the construction of the project, and they had to invest an additional $2.7 million into the construction to complete the vessel. The vessel has been received, and it is complete now at a total cost of about $6.7 million. So you can see on the bottom left there, those are the other bids from the project, and a lot of them came in around the $6 million mark. Just wanted to point that out. Moving on to the motor vessel Avon and Salvo contracts, it's important to understand that this is one single contract. Both boats were let under one contract. Total value currently is $24.3 million with a contract completion date of July 11th of 21. To date, we have paid $21.2 million to the contractor, and as Nick mentioned, we're accruing liquidated damages at $1,000 per day. Again, you can see the bids on the bottom. Just important to note, the original contract was for the motor vessel Avon at $11.8 million. The add-on for the motor vessel Salvo, $10.9 million. Again, some of the other contracts prices there. So I wanted to just kind of discuss vessel construction process to help understand where we're at. We had this slide put together. I'm starting in the bottom left corner with, there's kind of 4 groups of construction. And the first one is what we call preliminary design. It's figuring out what's the size, the speed, the range, how many people we want to carry, what kind of weather conditions, who's the classification society, the oversight for the regulators, and things like that. Once we have that preliminary design, that goes out to bid. to the shipyards. And then the shipyards are responsible for doing the detailed design, the detailed construction. This includes the piping systems, the electrical systems, the structural. One of the interesting points is the structural packages. So for the motor vessel Avon and Salvo, for instance, it would take about 2 football fields worth of steel to make the vessel. So how you cut the shapes out of the steel has a big impact on the cost to the shipbuilder. So that's something that the shipyard really has the flexibility to work with. And the last big point at the detailed design phase is that these systems need to be submitted to the regulators. So in our case, it's the U.S. Coast Guard, the Marine Safety Center. They have oversight for the vessels. As Nick mentioned, they're the federal regulator for us. So they approve these detailed construction drawings. Once we have the design done, then the contractor can actually start the construction. And I think one of the things that drew me to construction as a civil engineer is I like to think in these vessels like small cities, because they really have all of the components of a small city. We have all the structural with the steel work. We have all the piping, fitting, welding, all the electrical. Big one is the paint. It's not just to make the boats look pretty, but it's really to protect the investment in the steel. So these are very specialized paints, which continue to get more and more expensive. And then we have all of the systems. So we have our firefighting systems, we have our electrical production systems, we have our propulsion systems, propellers, rudders, we have life-saving systems, our rescue boats, our lifeboats, and then we have all of our habitability systems. We have HVAC, we have sewage treatment on board, we have all of these systems in the boats. And probably the biggest one these days is the IT systems. Nowadays, everything has a computer in it. For example, the motor vessel Avon Salvo on their governor, just one set point has one computer. The EasyGen 3000 has 3,000 set points to run one engine. So all of these systems need to work together. And it's one of the things that makes these constructions so difficult. And the logistics of the construction are key. Being able to actively manage the construction at the shipbuilder's level is so important to the success of these projects. We also have regulatory. They do periodic inspections throughout the construction. And lastly, we have the navigation systems, our GPS, our communications. Once the boat is built, then we move on to what we call phase 4, our delivery and our testing. So now that we have everything built, we have to prove that it works. Not only does it work, but do the redundant systems work? But what happens if we have a failure? You can't just park your car. You can't just park your boat. You have to get back to the dock. So there's rigorous testing involved, which is helpful for us because it proves that all of these systems are working the way they're supposed to. Finally, you have all the final paperwork from the regulator, the U.S. Coast Guard. And lastly, we have training for our crew members.
I think this will be a hard stop for us. It's at the appropriate slide. There's a lot of information that's still left here for us, and we would probably be better off starting again tomorrow from where we are, because there's going to be a lot of questions in the next section. So we appreciate that and appreciate you coming back tomorrow to finish your presentation. Folks, we have a hard stop. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to adjourn the meeting and we'll see you all tomorrow morning back at 8:30. Thank you very much.